the civil services as the steel frame of the unitary system. But at the same time, there is a curious ambivalence because there's language like India being a union of states. Because after all, in the US, it literally was a union of states. The states pre-existed and came together to create the union. But in our case, the union came first, and the union still has the constitutional right to create states, as we've seen with the creations of some of the more recent states in the last 25 years. So you've got a very interesting ambivalence, but that ambivalence need not be problematic if there is a fair balance. The overall objective ought to be that everybody, wherever they are in India, should feel they have an equal stake in the survival and success of our country. And federalism is a means of ensuring that. The problem has been that the attempts that were made to maintain that have sadly declined or been diluted over the years. We have seen, for example, a situation where the proportion of resources that the center transfers to the states has significantly declined. Central revenues have gone up. I think PTR and KTR can speak to this more than the other, Mr. Reddy, the finance ministers can speak to this better. But this has become a genuine challenge, and therefore the capacity, the ability of the states to balance the overweening authority of the center has been called into question like never before in the last decade or so. That, I think, is where the question of the spirit of federalism comes up. There was a balance. Has that balance been lost?
Thank you. So there was a balance, and in that balance, the center certainly played a crucial role, particularly, as you say, in the ability to form states. KTR, may I come to you first to ask you to reflect on precisely this. Before we get into what we are losing, to understand what was the nature of that balance, because the center played a very crucial role in actually creating, or continues in fact by virtue of its constitutional powers, in shaping the nature of the formation of states. So, you know, in your imagination of what federalism is as articulated in the Constitution, what is the role of the center in that framing?
Thank you, Yamini. Firstly, thanks to Vasu and team of South First for having us here. I think it's an honor to be on this panel. I've had the good fortune of meeting Tyaga for the first time. Good seeing you. Going to the question that you asked, I think the reference that you made with respect to Constituent Assembly debates, I think Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, just to quote him, because I don't want to get it wrong, he had very famously said, these provisions with respect to defining India as a union of the states make the Indian Constitution both unitary as well as federal, according to the requirements of time and circumstances. In normal times, it is framed to work as a federal system, but in times of war, some sort of an emergency or an exigency, it is so designed as to make it work as though it was a unitary system. So the fact is, India, without a question, as enshrined in the Constitution, is a federal republic. But the efforts that are being made over the last few decades, I'll not name names, but I'd definitely say both the union governments, whoever it was, have made consistent efforts to centralize power, have made deliberate attempts to ensure that union of states eventually sort of becomes a unitary state. And that is reflected in so many things. In fact, a classic example, as we sit here and speak on the 17th of September 2022, we've had an invasion of sorts in Hyderabad today. In fact, 17th of September 1948 is the day when Hyderabad became part of Indian Union. We integrated into Indian Union, and this was exactly 74 years ago. Now there are different interpretations, different versions. Some people would like to call it liberation, somebody else calls it integration. But the fact is, Hyderabad, the princely state of Hyderabad became part of Indian Union. Now, if you wanted to celebrate an occasion like this, if you wanted to commemorate an occasion like this, what should the union government do? You should talk to the state government, you should discuss with us, should seek our opinion, because after all, we are a democracy. Irrespective of our political ideologies, affiliations, we need to talk to each other, we need to consult with each other, and this is not a political party one-upmanship. This is not a BJP versus TRS. This is the union government versus the state government. So when the state government had its difference of opinion, today, in fact, like I said, we had an invasion of sorts. We have the Union Home Minister here, along with two other chief ministers and a couple of other cabinet ministers who are doing a parallel program to what the state government has envisioned and what the state government has planned. Now, this kind of conflicting message that is being given out by way of competing, claims on the same occasion is what is wrong with the federal structure of India today. Just to give you an example, I can quote a number of other things that are wrong, but since this happened this morning, so that's why, in fact, I feel there was a time right after independence where we had a union home minister who had actually flew down to Hyderabad to unite and integrate Hyderabad into Indian Union. Today we have a home minister after 74 years who flew down, who's trying to divide us and bully us, literally bully us into submission of sorts, wanting to subscribe to their ideology, wanting to just adhere to whatever they say, wanting to literally dictate terms to us, which is not acceptable. After all, we are the world's largest democracy, and this sort of, I am superior to you and you are subservient to me kind of an attitude is not something that I think was enshrined or was envisioned by the drafters of our Constitution.
Thank you. I think you make two very, very crucial points that I hope we can come back to through the course of the conversation. One, on the importance of deliberation as holding the key to maintaining the character of the federal principle. And second, the question of equity. The first among equals, or is there something above as the union and then states come below, which I hope we can discuss in greater detail. PTR, can I come to you to ask you this? On the nature of the fiscal architecture, the Constitution has been often characterized as imagining a relatively centralized fiscal architecture. Some call it the one-third, two-third problem, in that the bulk of fiscal monetary powers rest with the union, but the bulk of expenditure powers rest with the states, creating, in ideal world, conditions for cooperation, but in not so ideal worlds, conditions for dependency of states on the center. How do you interpret the Constitution's framing of the fiscal architecture for India?
First of all, thanks for inviting me and having me be part of this wonderful panel. Look, I think I'll just step back a little bit. I think at the heart of the notion of federalism is some component of every person's desire for self-determination and a place at the table where big decisions are made. I mean, that's really what federalism is all about. Nobody should be dictating my outcome without my input in the system, right? And you look at it state to union, or you look at it state to village. It's this notion that in a democracy there should be some participation and right to self-determination. Also, I think, as KTR pointed out, Ambedkar itself saw this as a function of time. If you look around the world, with economic progress, with increase in population, with increased education levels, you will see greater and greater devolution of power. You will see greater and greater, kind of flow down of decision making, because you get decision making closer to the people. That has 1,000 advantages, but that's how the rest of the world has gone. We started in a very unusual place, as many have pointed out. The words were there, but the design or the intention was not actually evident. I guess we could have gone the way of most of the world and started to see more devolution, more self-determination. In fact, we have seen the exact opposite. Particularly in the fiscal space, almost all direct taxation is with the union. That's very unique in the world. No other country has that much control. If you don't have any input into direct taxation, that means you don't have any right to determine whether you should be a progressive taxation regime or a regressive. All we get to do, at least we used to get to do, was set the sales taxes and the point of sale taxes and the regressive indirect taxes. Now even that we've sacrificed for the GST. So effectively, we have almost no control in the nature of revenue raising for the country. Are we really a socialist country? Are we really taking taxes from those who can afford to pay and using it to provide public goods and services and supporting those who, have fallen behind? We don't have an adequate say into that system, number one. Number two, it used to be that 2/3 of the spending was directed by the states. Maybe, I don't know. Right now, that's not true, because the way the union government diverts things into cesses and surcharges and then names all these schemes, PM this and, something and then they say we do partial funding the first year, and then they shift the funding to us the second year, and by the fourth year, we still have to call it PM something, but 100% of the funds come from us. So if you look at the percentage of devolution that comes through share of taxes compared to what comes through grants and schemes decided by the center, and increasingly in this regime, named after one individual in the center, then we have lost that independence or that self-determination or that participation as well. So in every way, from a fiscal perspective, from revenue raising, 90% now with the GST Council there. And with spending increasingly there, even though we are the administrators of that spending, they get to design how it should get done, then they get to ask for all kinds of data, then they get to say, no, you qualify, don't qualify. So I would say India started in the wrong place in terms of federalism and has regressed aggressively in the last 8 years or so.
We started in the wrong place and we have regressed. May I ask you, Ms. Reddy, for your view on that provocation, but also there was a third element to India's federal imagination, which was the local governments. In our constitution in 1950, we placed that into the directive principles, and it took all the way till the early 1990s and a constitutional amendment for them to be formally recognized as part of India's federal architecture. Did we, constitutionally, was that a mistake? Did we wait too long to recognize local governments and place them firmly within the architecture of our federal structure?
Yeah, first of all, thanks to the organizers and the founders of South First, Mr. Vasu and all the other founders, and also all the respected colleagues in the panel today. Well, coming to that, Yamini, I think you're very right in saying that it was delayed sizably, and then even after the delay, the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments that came in order to rectify that delay to some extent also did not actually materialize. Normally, there are two ways. One, the requirement of various areas or territories to come together and be one in order to have a common cause or protection or a common future, etc. The other is to hold territories by way of having a country or a republic. India actually became a union in peculiar circumstances which with a long history and various happenings. So the aspirations of the people of this country at that point of time when we got independence would be quite different from what the generation of today actually see or perceive. The local bodies should have been strengthened and should have been firmly in place right from day one. Because of the delay and because of it not happening, gradually over a period of time, there arose some sort of a blurredness between the relationship between center and state. Now states are complaining about the federal structure that includes autonomy, that includes fiscal matters. But how much are the states actually looking into the local bodies? How many states actually have empowered Zilla Parishads? How many states actually have empowered the Mandal Parishads or the Taluks? How many states have actually empowered the Panchayats? So sometimes what we do, we get in return. So I feel that this structure, federal structure, if implemented in spirit and objective right to the level of Gram Panchayat, will actually over a period of time stop this change of policy or change of objective which actually was envisaged by the authors of our constitution.
Thank you. I hope we can discuss, we have 3 different states here and Kerala, so 4. So I hope we can also look at the differences in local government participation across the different states too, which is such a unique characteristic of our federal structure as well. But let me pick up on this question of, so maybe in 1950 it was somewhat regressive, or at least at any rate there was an imagination of a relatively strong center. But if you look at the arc of independent India, especially after single party dominance of Congress starts breaking, democracy gives you a great vibrancy of federalism. So to Ambedkar's imagination of us moving from unitary to federalism, regional parties start playing a really important role in our national politics as well. Yet, the puzzle that has always been on my mind, why is it in those peak years of very vibrant, in fact at some point political scientists would argue that national elections in India are in fact state elections, because it's this coming together of states that is forming the coalitions on in Delhi, yet very little was done to shift this initial architecture. Shashi, what is your view on that?
Well, I think that a lot depends on how the government of the center runs the country. And I think with the exception of a brief period in the 90s, when there was even talk of the states owning Delhi, when the government was essentially comprised largely of regional parties, you do have parties with a so-called national vision in power in Delhi who tend to ride roughshod over the rights and sensibilities of states. I mean, a very good example was as recently as the proclamation of the lockdown for COVID, where though the states would have to implement that lockdown, they were not consulted. It was a decision announced by the Prime Minister on television sort of 3 hours before it needed to be implemented. And it was done using a rather obscure article of the National Disaster Management Act. But that was the end of any pretense of federal authority on this. It was just as when Mrs. Gandhi proclaimed the emergency in 75, the states sort of woke up to the news. The same thing happened with the COVID lockdown. And you see this time and time again, even since PTR was talking about fiscal allocations. Look at the allocations for to the states from the Disaster Management Fund. When COVID came along, you'll see no relationship between the population of the states, their COVID burden, the number of migrants they had to deal with, and the amount of money that that fund decided to allocate to them. So we're seeing time after time the tendency of those in power in Delhi, using, of course, the argument of the national vision to take those decisions. I do take the point that you and Mr. Reddy have made about the local governments. I think Kerala is an honorable exception in many ways, in that local governments have been empowered to a very great extent, and that you're seeing some genuine devolution of authority, and not yet budgetary, not yet adequate budgetary means, but it's still better than most other states that I'm aware of. And that is an anomaly in all this, because if the states can argue that they are being wrongly treated by the center, the districts can argue they're being wrongly treated by the states. Having said that, the states have a good excuse nowadays, which is that the money they're getting from the center hasn't gone up. It's very interesting when you saw the Finance Commission, the 14th Finance Commission, recommending a significant increase in the proportion of taxes that should be paid to the states. Promptly, the central government implemented that and then reduced instead the amount of other tax they could hold on to. So the net result was a wash. I mean, the states didn't get a penny more, though the argument was they needed more money that they could have the discretion to spend. So there's no question that, I mean, as PTR has argued, that you're seeing a heavy tilting of the scales towards the union government, and that's become more pronounced, it seems to me, in recent years.
So you mentioned the 14th Finance Commission, and it was, I think, in more ways than one, a watershed moment for fiscal federalism in India by virtue of the attempt to enhance devolution to states. But about that time, colleagues and I were spending a fair amount of time talking to line ministries and bureaucrats within states. And one of the things that struck us a lot in those conversations is how much, at least the bureaucracy and the line departments, were unhappy because what the center did was, having done the devolution, it reduced the allocations to several centrally sponsored schemes. Now, centrally sponsored schemes have been the bane of most state governments since the 1960s, I think commission after commission after commission has complained about centrally sponsored schemes, and attempts have been made every now and again to reduce the number of centrally sponsored schemes from 500 to 120, then goes back to 200. Now apparently it's 28, but it's actually about 150. And if you look at the DBT database, there's 400 schemes that the government of India has for which money is flowing. So these abound everywhere, and state governments complain a lot. But I was struck, and this is an open question to any one of you who would want to pick this up to answer, why it is that, at least in the bureaucracy, at that particular moment, there was great annoyance about the reduction of centrally sponsored schemes. In fact, it felt like we had just turned the clock to say, don't take those back, give them back to us all over again, line department after line department, not finance departments, though, and I'll come to that in a minute. But what is it about the tensions of these centrally sponsored schemes? They've always been there. Politically, it's always been a source of complaining. But whenever they get reduced, the argument is for more.
I think Shashi lives in Delhi, he should take this. He has more interaction with bureaucrats.
Three of you have full rights to answer that.
Let me just quickly jump in. I think when Shashi was speaking, I was thinking of how India has really become, as Tyaga said, I think over a period of time, it has really regressed, and the spirit of federalism really it has come to a situation where now everything is centered around people and personalities. There was a time, with all due respect, when somebody famously said, India is Indira and Indira is India. The whole personality cult thing. Now something very similar, but even more, possibly more drastic, where stadiums are being renamed, where medical colleges are being renamed, and I'm guessing if the Union Finance Minister has a way, I think the new currency notes also will have, the Prime Minister's image. Possibly they'll even replace Mahatma Gandhi's image. I have no doubt in my mind. Because we have a situation where it's funny, embarrassing, and also sometimes upsetting. We've had the Union Finance Minister here recently, a couple of weeks ago. She went to a fair price shop in a district about 100 kilometers from here. And she was making a scene out there like a street level BJP worker, asking the collector right in front of about 200 people as to where the Prime Minister's photo in the fair price shop was. Now the point I'm trying to make is, if we are truly a federal republic, as we are supposed to be, why are we fighting over an individual's pictures and in the institutions that we've built at the grassroots level? I mean, if I can certainly counter it and say, when Modi ji was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, did he put up Dr. Manmohan Singh's pictures in all the fair price shops in Gujarat? I don't think so. The point I'm trying to make is, none of our enactments, none of our legislations actually mandate this kind of cult worship. What has essentially happened, Yamini, in my humble opinion is, while we are called the world's largest parliamentary democracy, we function like a presidential democracy and not like a parliamentary democracy. Essentially, everything being centralized. And this applies to states as well. By the way, I'm not saying this only about the union government, I'm also saying the same thing about state government. Even the states, as Rajendra said, we do also, in fact, barring Kerala probably, I think we do not empower our local governments enough. We don't empower our local governments enough. So, yes, what you do is sometimes what you get, karma is a boomerang, like they say. But the point is, we need to, at some point, draw lines, clear distinctions, and say, okay, now let's define our roles, the defense, railways, and there are certain areas we have simply no role. That should be left to the union government. And what is the union government doing today with respect to Narega? They want to deposit funds from the Narega kitty directly into the workers' account in a village. Now, do the states not get to decide what sort of work needs to be taken up? Kerala may have done some things, Telangana may have done some things, Tamil Nadu would want to do something else, and Andhra might be wanting to do something else. We are all on different stages of learning curve. Now, this is the essence of federalism, trying to ensure that we understand stronger the states are, stronger the country is going to be. Each state needs to align its priorities in tandem with its local governments. In Telangana, we run a program called as Palle Pragati and Pattan Pragati. Today, when Government of India is rated the top 20 best villages in the country, 19 are from Telangana because of this program. The point I'm trying to make is, when we are operating with a focus and when we are trying to up our game, all the union government needs to do is encourage performance and leave it to us to decide what central sponsored scheme that we need to participate in and what we can opt out of. If that sort of flexibility is given to us, as opposed to thrusting things down our throat, I think then we truly will become a strong nation. And as Prime Minister calls it, Amrut Kal and Achhe Din will come fairly quickly.
Flexibility in centrally sponsored schemes, PTR, do you think that's part of the menu of solutions to reimagining the federal compact?
Yeah, I'm not even clear why we should have centrally sponsored schemes as opposed to giving the money to the people, right? I have a video clip picking up from my friend of then Chief Minister of Gujarat, Thiru Narendra Modi, going on a long exposition. It's in Hindi. I can play it here if you want. He says, Mama ka paisa. Yeah, he says, he says the states have been feeding the poor for decades. All of a sudden the union comes and says, this is coming from me. What does that mean? All these things, right? So I think there are some clear roles for the union, foreign affairs, defense, currency stabilization, trade, policies. But when it comes to what is right, I mean, you and I have talked about this before. You've seen so many CAG reports, not our reports, CAG reports that talk about Swachh Bharat scheme toilets built with no water, because the union government cannot supply water, only the local body can supply water. Or funds sent and not used because you cannot whitewash a thatched school, right? And this notion that somehow you can direct or dictate policy. And then the question then is, what is the intent? Is it to create a kind of cult? Is it to, so, we have an insurance program, or for that matter, PDS. In all of these things, Tamil Nadu was certainly ahead of the Indian average or the design of the union scheme. Then they design a scheme, and then they say, you have to change the name. If you want some share of it to be funded by the union, you have to change the name. We have an insurance program. They want to partly fund some of it. They say you have to put the Prime Minister's image on the card, on the ID card. I mean, we were already doing it before. Now, you get some. So, and I'll go even to the extreme in terms of schemes, right? Like they have the scheme called Jal Jeevan scheme, right? And it started out with, 60 or 80-20, then 60-40, then 40-60, the usual model, sliding scale. But they incentivize you to actually take the tap into every house in every village. Now, in a lot of cases, the villagers don't want the tap in their house. They have their own, mores and their own psychology about it. They want a public tap on the street. In my constituency, in colonies where I've offered to run taps into the house, they say, no, leave the tap outside my house, not inside my house. But the scheme says you only get funding if you take the tap inside the house, right? This last mile delivery, why should there be a standardized model coming from Delhi about last mile delivery? Different people have different preferences. That's what the states exist for. That's what the local bodies exist for. Now, as far as the local bodies, I definitely take my friend's comment because, he has, unlike me, he has served as a sarpanch at a local body level. I completely agree with the lack of devolution. But it's a double-edged sword. In the case of Tamil Nadu, a lot of our problems with local bodies have to do with the caste problem. And it has to do with no matter what you do about reservations and all that. Once you get to a granular level where within the same geographical area, you reserve this as let's say, a SC seat, but there is a whole lot of non-SC people there. You start having caste problems, and there's been violence and murders and all kinds of clashes and stuff like that. So my colleague, I'm also the Minister for Planning, my colleague, the Vice Chairman of the Planning Commission of Tamil Nadu, says the single biggest improvement in delivery of services and the equality of society in the rural areas of Tamil Nadu was when the line department started driving the programs rather than the local body elected officials. Because if they did that, it was very biased, and even letting out the temple lands and managing the tanks and all that, they would do on a caste basis or a communal basis or a religion basis or something. And once you standardize the model from Chennai, then it became actually better delivery. So I completely agree, you can't have it always. You can't say, I want devolution to my level, but not below me. And again, I think time changes things, right? If you have greater education levels, you have greater integration, more harmony, then you do more devolution. And I think some states, and maybe there's a correlation between the communist philosophy and the fact that Kerala has such high devolution, maybe. But
I think all parties take equal credit for that.
But you know, some of these things should never be aggregated. There is no natural reason for a one-size-fits-all aggregated model coming from Delhi. That's my idea.
I think one of the big governance challenges for India is that we still haven't passed out what level of government should be performing what level of function, and it leads to a consistent set of overlaps across the board. I was going to pose the next question, but you've thrown such an important provocation about local governments and the local context that I think, Mr. Reddy, you have to answer that. Because if I at the risk of making a too broad a statement out of your somewhat more nuanced point, would it be right to say that the inequalities at the grassroots level should necessitate a little bit more centralization from the state? I'm just throwing this out as a provocation because I think that's one of the very critical reasons why centralization at the state level has often happened at the cost of deeper devolution to local governments.
These things, Yamini, I feel are very state specific. With in acknowledgement and also due respect to the opinions of my colleagues here, transgression of responsibilities and duties, overlaps normally happen vertically. Now, the duty of a local body representative, a sarpanch or a taluk board president is well defined, but the MLA wants to go and see what all is happening, right from laying of drains to roads to water. This is clearly the role of a local body.
And the MP also with the MP-led
The MP also. And now, MLA is transgressing into the local bodies, Parliament is transgressing into the legislatures, so is the result with regard to local bodies, legislatures and Parliament. Next comes whether there should be a more centralized monitoring and spending. I believe that in a democracy, ultimately, it is the elected representative who should have supreme power. He is elected by the public. If the public do not like his whatever capacities, there is always a provision to replace him when the period ends. But I have in my own experience seen that anybody who is elected by the public have a far better understanding of the needs of the public than anyone else in the system. And now when it comes to the expenditures that are made, I belonging to a state as well as to a regional party, at the same time, to be fair and be objective, the money that is being spent by the center for the schemes, central sponsored schemes, are outside of the money that is already devolved to the states. So, when the center spends certain amount of money on CASD, centralized state development schemes, or the centrally sponsored schemes. So, centrally sponsored schemes are 100% spent by the center, and CASDs are partly spent with contribution by the state. So these are framed in such a way based on the requirement. Now, as Mr. PTR said, there are state-specific, and as Mr. KTR also said, state-specific needs are there where maybe the CASDs have to be, the states have to be given a little more autonomy to design schemes that are more suitable for their requirement. But at the same time, broadly speaking, when the center is spending money for the public, if the state wants to have its own emblem or own mark or trademark, so also we should allow the center to do it.
Okay, can I just interrupt for a, sorry to interrupt. My point is very simple, very straight. I agree with you and I don't have a problem with centrally sponsored schemes either. The problem arises when somebody tries to impose their ideology. The issue is not centrally sponsored schemes or the larger good that is aimed at for the betterment of the society. That is not a problem at all. See, between all of us, the southern states, we are 19% of the population of this country, but we contribute to 35% of the GDP of this country. So when somebody from Delhi flies into Hyderabad and tells us that I am the giver and you are the taker. You know, the attitude that kicks in, you know, that हमने आपको 2 लाख करोड़ दिया. Now that really puts me off. Because, you know, every rupee I contribute from Telangana, my exchequer contributes from Telangana, what we get back is 46 paisa. For every rupee that is contributed from the south of India, 35% of the GDP, we do not get back. I'm not even asking, I'm not even suggesting that I get back every single paisa. I know that there is defense, I know that there is railways, I know that there are laggard states, I know that there are roles that the government of India needs to fulfill, which of course we are happy to contribute, and we are happy to, you know, as an Indian citizen, we are happy to, you know, be a part of the nation building. But the problem is the attitude of those who run Delhi. You know, they come with a chip on their shoulder and they tell us, listen, हम देने वाले हैं, आप लेने वाले हैं. तो इसीलिए हम जब देते हैं, आप हम जो कहते हैं, whatever we say, Telangana, in the last 8 years, we have completed drinking water connection to each and every home. In fact, that became inspiration to Har Ghar Jal. In Telangana, we have done some very, very focused programs on tank revival. In Telangana, we've also completed some large lift irrigation projects. So I have a different set of priorities from my friends here. Now, why should I not get to decide what I should do with my devolution money and with also my money that is being proposed in centrally sponsored schemes? The last thing I'll say is, you know, this whole myth about devolution, how it has been enhanced by Modi ji. Actually, the fact is, 41% that we received today, because of all this cess and other things that is happening, we only get 29%, which is far worse than what it was. So this whole, again, abrogation of sorts of responsibilities, or, you know, this obfuscation that they indulge in, you know, and kind of try and take away the money that rightfully belongs to the states by way of imposing additional excise duties and other things. It is a travesty. So this needs to be challenged, this needs to be addressed, and if needed, it needs to be challenged legally as well.
In fact,
So as Mr. KTR said, the actual increase in devolution and more autonomy to the state happened during the 14th Finance Commission while Dr. Y.V. Reddy was the chairman. Because the 14th Finance Commission felt that states ought to have more autonomy and independence into doing what they want with the money, and it need not be dictated by the center. But unfortunately, that 42 finally now comes down to only about 30%, 10% lesser than what we are entitled to get for various reasons, cesses, etc., etc. But then coming to the issue of center-state, I think this relationship between center, state, federal structure, etc. has to happen from top to bottom. It cannot stop midway or start midway. It has to start from top and go down up to the Gram Panchayat level. Only then everybody understands what the actual responsibilities are, what the actual authorities are, and what the duties are.
So I just want to say one thing about the centrally sponsored schemes. I mean, I'm relatively new in politics, but 15th Finance Commission Chairman, Mr. N.K. Singh, at some seminar we were at, he said there wasn't actually this whole, it wasn't like a constitutional carve-out that there should be centrally sponsored schemes. Certain governments started it when states benefited, and they still had a say in its design, and it was a participative kind of approach. They didn't object. This regime has just taken it to extremes and made it dictatorial, and, you know, to suit their political needs as opposed to the needs of the people. But it's not like inherent in the constitution that there should be centrally sponsored schemes. It's not like they're particularly well designed to execute anything. I mean, as I think former Chief Minister of then unified Andhra said, the union is a myth, right? It's an integration of all the money that comes from the states, politicians that come from the states, IAS officers that come from the states, IPS officers that come from the states. It is a temporary gathering of people to facilitate the distribution, redistribution, devolution of what comes from the states. It's not like it drops from the sky to the union and then they divide it up to us, right? So this notion that there should be something that they know better than us itself is a flawed notion, right? There's no natural place for them to have this. And I mean, listen, I'm far, far less strident than the former Chief Minister of Gujarat, Narendra Modi, when he said the same things when he was Chief Minister.
Well, when they abolished the Planning Commission, they should have got rid of the centrally sponsored schemes along with it, maybe?
No, but I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that came from that. In fact, when KTR was talking about the how much money Telangana gets back on the taxes it pays. Historically, the South has been subsidizing the North. There's very little doubt about that. And other states, I remember Mr. Siddaramaiah, when the terms of reference of the 15th Commission, Finance Commission came out, he pointed out that for every 1 rupee of tax contributed by Uttar Pradesh, the state receives 179 back, whereas Karnataka, rather like Telangana today, allocations. So, unlike most other federal systems, India's revenues go disproportionately to our worst performing states. And those are usually states with poor levels of education, high rates of fertility and population growth. And the South, where these things are done better and they are high performance states by any yardstick, thereby get short shrift, which is actually going to the heart of the issues of federalism. Because if indeed, as a result of the federal system, you're subsidizing the poorer performing states, in principle, no argument. But if the way in which it's done seems to reward lack of performance, population growth resulting from that particular misgovernance in some of these states, and those who are performing well get penalized. In other words, if Kerala runs much better health outcomes and much better educational outcomes, its reward should not be to get less money from the center for health and for education. But that's de facto what's happening. And this remains a serious problem, it seems to me, and goes to the heart of the whole question as to why many of the southern states are talking to you. I do want to join the others in congratulating the organizers for getting these fine minds from the south together. I think I'm the only one from a non-regional party on this panel, but the idea is precisely that it's high time we woke up to the fact that the South has real concerns.
I just have one provocative thought for the finance ministers, and I think for all of us. You know, when we say federal, are we fully federal? Are we truly federal? You know, if you look at the United States, they are also a federal republic. In the United States, you know, this whole question about devolution, you know, collecting taxes and then devolving, as opposed to that, why can't we think and why can't we propose a system where even the income tax, even the corporate tax is actually collected and, you know, deducted at the source? Why should we pay to the center and then go to Delhi and line up each of our finance ministers and, you know, I wouldn't call it a bowl of sorts, but, you know, kind of make a request, plead with them, and then eventually get our money back a few months later? Why can't we actually be a truly, fully federal republic and actually start collecting taxes at the source, including income tax and corporate tax?
To add to that, from a northern perspective, how do you then deal with the fact that growth paths have taken our country?
When I said that, I mean our share of the income tax and corporate tax. I don't mean the whole thing.
So, but I'm just going to throw out one element to this, which is the challenge of inequality. You have such huge convergence, such huge divergence, which all economic theory would have argued over time would have led closer towards convergence, but there's no sign of that convergence, and we still sit within the union. So there has to be equitable sharing. It is a very integrated economy, as we discovered in the times of COVID. The fact that labor and capital moves, it moves from the north to the south, so there is an interdependency. In some senses, it sharpens the federal, it's a sign of a sharpened federal tension, but also a sign of deepened federalism. So how do we balance these two tensions as we go forward in a fairly fraught environment?
Let me take the simple question first, right? I mean, I think certainly we have many examples of societies where income taxes or direct taxes happen at multiple levels. So, you know, both KTR and I lived in the US for many years. The federal government takes some tax, the state government takes some tax, the city of New York takes some tax, the city of Los Angeles takes some tax, right? These are all independent of each other. So certainly at some point we have to say that the power of direct taxation has to be given to the states, whatever the constitutional need for that is. But there's a broader problem here. I think in no federal society are all people the same, right? Like economically, you will always find better offs and less well-offs. The unique problem of India, and why I said to the 15th Finance Commission in my submission, written submission, I said, if equality and efficiency were the targets of finance commissions, then you all have been miserable failures for 25 years. Because every other society in the world, every other country in the world, the US, China, European Union, wherever, you take funds from the better off, you give it to the less well off, And whatever the measure is, it converges, longevity, health measures, per capita income, education access. It converges. That's what the transfers are supposed to do. In our case, not only it doesn't converge, not only it doesn't stay the same, not only it's diverging, it's accelerating in its divergence. So the ratio keeps changing again and again, and still the outcome gets worse and worse. Let's just take Tamil Nadu's case. At one point, we were roughly 7.5% of the population, 7.5% of the GDP, got about 7% of the tax devolution of that 32% that they devolved. Now we are less than 6%, I think, of the population, about 10.5% of the GDP, and we get about 4% of the taxes. That means for 25 years, these things have been going the wrong way, and we are not getting convergence. So there's something structurally wrong. And what's structurally wrong is not with us. What's structurally wrong is in those northern states where despite getting massive devolution, despite getting massive transfers, they are not able to improve the quality of people's lives, the average education access, or the social development indicators or human development indicators. So if your measures on which you allocate, you know the formula for the Finance Commission, some population, some gap to actual, all these forest cover, land and all that. Clearly they're allocating the money on the wrong dimensions because they keep on allocating more money and things keep getting worse. So there's something profoundly wrong in the developmental model of the northern states, particularly the Hindi belt, that unless that is fixed, no matter how much money you transfer, you're not going to be able to fix the problem. You can do politics with it, but you can't improve people's lives unless you find out what that is. And I have written in my submission, one main thing they can fix is empower women, ensure girls stay in school, delay marriages, get them, better health outcomes. And they haven't done that. That's really, even a state like Gujarat that has slightly higher per capita income than Tamil Nadu, 50% or so of the girls around 18 are not in school. That's not true in any southern state, right? So there's something structurally wrong that money can't fix, that needs to be fixed some other way. Otherwise, we are just keeping on going the wrong way. No other country, no other union in the world has this bad an outcome.
I completely agree with him on how miserably they have failed in the north. But they come here and lecture us, by the way. You have to admire their temerity. You have to really admire their guts and temerity to come to the south, lecture all of us on how to run our states and how to actually administer, and how miserably we have done vis-a-vis them. When the fact is, all the indicators, no matter what you take, all the human development indices, all the social indicators will show you otherwise.
There is, I think what both of you are saying gets to the heart of the governance issue. And there is a lot to be learned. That's why federalism matters so much from what different states are doing. So the country learned from the midday meals. The country also learned from Bihar's attempt at giving bicycles to girls to try and bring them, get them to secondary schools. And in all of this, I think one aspect that we haven't talked about much is, and you brought it up in your initial remarks, the question of deliberation, that at the heart of federalism is the idea of coming together to dialogue, to deliberate, to share, to learn, and evolve solutions to these very wicked, hard problems. There has been, Ms. Reddy, if you can reflect a little bit on this, constant attempts in our history of trying to create these so-called sites of deliberation. The Interstate Council, which is now a punishment posting for the bureaucrat. The Planning Commission, everybody said, was filled with all kinds of problems. The National Development Council did not work, so we created the Niti Aayog. But then we left it to the finance departments, or the Ministry of Finance rather, to do deliberation with states. The GST Council, which was meant to be a site of deliberation, it works sometimes, it doesn't on other occasions. How do we think about this institutional question? Are we missing something? And what kind of space do we need for states to come together? The regional coming together, of course, is full of learning. The southern states coming together, the northeastern states coming together. But there's a lot needed for this deliberative environment to come together. Is it an institutional problem as well as much as it is a political problem?
I think it is both. Quite well held, and we could see sizable outcome. Of course, I believe for a very long time, zonal council meetings were not held.